Thanks, Jim. I'm excited to dig into this question with Rebekah Moses, Vice President of Impact Strategy at IronOx, and Lieb, Vice President of Sustainability at Alle Farms today. So, Rebekah and Lee, your products have lower carbon footprints than the traditional foods they're designed to replace already. And since you have quite limited resources as a startup, you could say that the products you're making are already enough of a contribution to the climate crisis. So, Lee, I'm curious, what's really the case for pursuing net zero operations and supply chains on top of that?
Thanks, Theresa, for having me and also for the question. So Alle Farm has came out with the commitment of becoming net zero carbon by 2025 from inception in our operations and throughout our supply chain by 2030. This was inspired by when we arrived to COP25 in Madrid 3 years ago and understood that this is where the world is going. And as we build our company, we need to incorporate that understanding and understand that actually, if we want to build a smart company and do a smart business, we want to really already think about where we're going, where the future is, and how we want to create a really sustainable business. Understanding that a lot of these big corporates are now dealing that in the next 10, 20, 30 years, they need to reduce completely their carbon footprint. So we decided to come with a different approach and build a company from inception at zero.
All right, that's a big task. So Rebekah, since IronOx already has a bigger operational footprint than Alle Farms, and you're trying to do a very similar thing, I'd like to hear a little bit about the details of what that looks like. So from the insights that you have gotten into your emissions, can you talk about what the differences and similarities are between your net zero roadmap and those of larger companies across the scopes 1, 2, and 3?
I think about this in kind of two models of disruptor startups when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. And the first is this like low impact category where you have things like plant-based meat. It's just lower impact, full stop. Like you should have at least, probably 50% lower climate burden of plant-based anything. But to be meaningful in real terms, that requires some things to happen still. Requires real market displacement of the competitor to deliver on this sustainability potential. So the products need to create this like long-term consumer switching, need to address the real value drivers of the competitor industry. So you have to get out of things like ground beef, ground chicken. You need investment in whole cuts. And that's why I'm super excited about what Lee and Aleph are doing, Alle Farms. The second category, I think, is where we fall. And that's really more around controllable impact. And so I'll put most of indoor farming here because this category is not inherently sustainable. It is capable of being dramatically better if the business consciously grows in the right way. So this is a group of businesses that are able to, access decarbonization tactics or technologies in ways that their peers or competitor industries probably can't. And so indoor farming just has more options and sometimes more powerful options for really economically decarbonizing the crop at scale, in particular for a commodity market, which is quite challenging. And that's why IronOx committed to net zero, because we have this solvable series based on what we know from an LCA, from greenhouse gas emissions inventory work. We have a solvable series of energy and built environment emissions drivers. So like 90% of our scope 1, scope 2 emissions are energy related. Scope 3 emissions are really all around built environment, cement and steel, polycarbonate that make up the building and the robotics. And so, these are things we can address. What is energy? It's electricity and it's heat. Electricity is relatively easy. You can source renewable, you can build solar, you can buy nuclear, whatever. Heat's harder. And you can't just get the greenhouse gas emissions out of natural gas or out of propane. So we realized that we'd probably have to do something that you don't really see in the market right now, which is to electrify greenhouses to get control over that. And so similarly, scope 3 becomes basically a supply chain innovation issue. You have to work closely with architects, partnering maybe with like carbon capture cement manufacturers, design out everything that you can, things like steel. So that's kind of the two ways that you could think about this for our community.
So it sounds like the challenges for decarbonization and the things that you actually need to do are quite similar to what a lot of big companies are working on. And I wonder what the support system for startups looks like. do you have net zero roadmaps and reporting frameworks that will help you do the work, or how are you going to make progress on this? Lieb, do you want to kick us off on that one?
Sure. So actually, we came out with our commitment 3 years ago. We were really excited about it, and we were sure that we were going to get these incentives pushing us, because this is where we want to take, future companies, creating a net zero roadmap from inception and from design. But we actually noticed that we were not eligible to the typical frameworks that currently exist, like the Race to Net Zero or the SBTI framework. And that's because these frameworks demand a baseline. So you need a polluting baseline and then begin your reduction process. And that is excellent for a big corporate, but for a young company that wants to build from design is actually where we're not eligible, because we don't have that baseline, because we want to build from the start. So this is something that kind of came to our surprise, and we're really pushing forward now to find new frameworks that can push and support younger companies, startups that are not yet commercial but want to come out with that net zero approach, and really be part of that frameworks and that network and ecosystem to support them, because in the end, we are the future companies looking forward into the future of our economy.
Rebekah, how does that resonate with you? Are you struggling with frameworks as well, mostly, and what other constraints are you working under?
Yeah, I mean, what Lee was talking about is completely correct. These frameworks were not built for us. The frustrating thing with that also is that you can wind up in this position where the frameworks are still kind of like permission to play. They get you a seat at the table. And if they're not built for you, you wind up missing out, I think, collectively on the institutional knowledge that these disruptive startups bring. And that's something I think that has these kind of ecosystem level repercussions that are not great. So it's super important. What she's talking about is getting these pre-competitive frameworks in place. There's also kind of just a different capital reality for us. It's a feature that startups are just capital constrained. There's lots of ways this shows up for net zero. You don't necessarily have purchasing power and supply chain. You do have a great story and a mission, and that helps find strategic scaling partners, hopefully who are like mutually hungry for innovation. And you might be pre-revenue. So your kind of tax burden profile looks different, and tax write-offs on things like solar installations are not as clear, although we have seen things like the IRA passing and making that instantly a little bit easier on things like solar panel installation. But big swings, things like CapEx investments for like on-site energy, those things might have to be accretive, because your options for financing it probably aren't what they would be for a big CPG. So you just kind of have to start small in some cases and then build as you can and be super, super agile. The nice part, though, about being a startup pursuing deep decarbonization is that even though you don't have the benefit of a learning curve, you do get to design for zero, as Lee was saying. You get to start close to zero, stay there with a dynamic baseline of some kind, but you don't have to unlearn anything, and you don't have to completely change your business model. So that's what keeps me pretty optimistic about our community's goals. Is it's quite messy, but it's not like we're going kicking and screaming like an oil company or commodity meat producer into these commitments. And maybe their commitments are just kind of kicking the can down the road. So I probably can't find $5 million in the couch cushions on any given day, but I don't have to turn a ship 180 degrees to not destroy the planet. So that 180 is probably a bigger lift, honestly, than building to zero. And that'll become even more and more apparent as we get these collective frameworks for our type of industry.
So to help you on that roadmap to deep decarbonization that you laid out, what products and services would you like to see in the marketplace?
I think I'm almost thinking about this less as a product and services model and more about what we've talked about here, which is the sort of like collective organization. And I think we're starting to see that already. It's this combination of organizing ourselves and being willing as disruptor startups to open source some of the good stuff happening internally. And there's this great kind of, when I say great, I don't mean good. There's this like great ongoing crime happening in business schools that are still really teaching that sustainability is a competitive advantage. And I don't even find that to be true, let alone helpful. It should be table stakes for one. And it's hard to be even directionally correct on sustainability issues as a consumer, in part because the marketing has become so savvy and I think consumers are starting to realize and get pretty skeptical. So it's this shared collective interest in making ourselves look good in a given sector, because everybody is going to get painted with the same brush. I've long tried to open source as much of our impact strategy work as possible, whether that's LCAs and methodologies, academic papers, consumer toolkits. And, we were asked by investors to create a roadmap to net zero for indoor farming. And so we did that as a white paper, and we're going to be releasing that probably at the end of Q4, maybe Q1. And personally and professionally, I've really benefited from our community of disruptor startups and leaders like Lee, like other colleagues in the field, who are really generous with learnings.
Lee, what does the path forward look like for you?
Well, I loved what Rebekah said, because I think it is all about building the ecosystem. And I think there needs to be pre-competitive issues that we kind of look and say we need to push together. Because there's, on one hand, when you want to create a sustainable company, yes, of course, you have your IP and your technology, but in the end, you also need infrastructure, right? You want to build a facility, you need steel, you need concrete, you need renewable energies, you need specific things that are not so unique to any other industry or any other company. And this is something where you can look at it in a collective way and say, hey, we can support a full industry as we move forward.
I think that's a great note to end on. And that's all we have time for today. So thank you so much for the work that you do and for sharing it with us today. Lee and Rebekah, back to you, Jim.
Thank you.